Hello everyone and welcome to History's Dark Chronicles. I am your host, Alan G. And if you like what you see, hit the like, subscribe, hit the bell, let you know of any future episodes. As an historian, I became embroiled in a debate regarding an incident that occurred during World War I. Now, as most of you know, I tend to think of myself as a World War I specialist. Notice I said specialist and not expert. I continue to educate myself, my students, and my friends on aspects of that great conflict that they may want clarified. I came into contact with a Facebook site that spoke of an Armenian Holocaust as if it were a hoax. One of the main sources of contention is the Armenian genocide, which started in 1915. These were Armenians living in the Ottoman Empire who happened to be Christians. To this day, even though it occurred during the last days of the Ottoman Empire, the Turks refuse to admit that their predecessors were responsible for the deaths of hundreds of thousands of Armenian Christians. Here is the story that Turkey tried to hide. Ottoman's Christian minorities. The Ottoman ruler at the time, Sultan Abdul Hamid II, then announced they would have a parliamentary government with a constitutional monarchy and entered into negotiations with the Western powers. Again, just a show for those paying attention. During the Russo-Turkish War of 1877-1878, Russian victory entitled them to occupy vast amounts of eastern Turkey. but before entire districts of Armenian occupants had been massacred under the Ottomans. During negotiations for the Treaty of San Stefan, officially ending the war, the Armenian Patriarch of Constantinople requested that the Russians include in the treaty some provisions granting self-government to the Armenians. The Turks rejected the clause flat out. However, Russia and the Ottomans agreed to implementations of reforms on behalf of the Armenians and guaranteed that Russia would become the Armenian protector. This clause became known as the Armenian Question. When Great Britain received a copy of the treaty, they objected to the clause guaranteeing Russia as Armenia's protector. Great Britain believed that it ceded entirely too much influence on Russia in that part of the world. Great Britain then pushed for a conference to discuss the issue of Armenian autonomy further, which culminated in the Congress of Berlin in 1878. Archbishop Crimean Hayrik, the Armenian representative, reached the Congress of Berlin. Officials at the conference refused to allow Archbishop Hayrik into the meeting because he represented no country. Although he attended from the periphery, the Archbishop's pleas with the major powers attending the conference had no effect on any significant change to the treatment Armenian Christians continued to receive. Great Britain revised the treaty, but did not remove the guarantee of Russia as the protector. With their safety and promises of autonomy disappeared, believing that any reforms concerning their treatment would change, Armenian Christians and intellectuals advocated the formation of political parties dedicated to the betterment of the Armenian people within the Ottoman Empire. Although this movement tried, through peaceful means, to gain their autonomy, the organization soon advocated self-defense as a way to get what they felt they deserved. They also advocated getting the European powers to recognize these efforts and pressure the Ottoman government to implement the reforms. After the Treaty of Berlin was signed, Sultan Abdul Hamid II attempted to stall the efforts of the treaty for the Armenians and appointed a special council of Kurds known as the Hamidai, which were given permission by the Sultan to deal with the Armenians as they wished. The rapes, murders, and denigrations continued, where the Ottoman government dispelled the reports as exaggerated. The Sultan and the Parliament would purposefully implement high taxation to provoke local revolts with the hopes of using military force to quell such rebellions. When the excesses of the government were brought to the attention of the powers, they forced Abdul Hamid to sign a reform package for the Armenians. Again, like any earlier reforms, they were never implemented. In October 1895, 2,000 Armenians congregated in Constantinople to demand that reforms be implemented. The Sultan met the protesters with military force. The massacres of Armenians in the capital began a short period of wholesale murders of Armenian Christians throughout the remaining empire. These became known as the Hamidian massacres, and historical figures estimated the murdered Armenians numbered from 100,000 to 300,000. Because of what the Armenian Christians believed to be indifference to their plight, a group calling themselves the Armenian Revolutionary Federation seized the European-managed Ottoman Bank on August 26, 1896. Sympathy toward the Christian Armenians began to escalate with this incident, and Hamid received the moniker of the Great Assassin. He gave his tacit approval towards the treatment of the Armenians. The great powers vowed that they would take action, but due to other concerns, again, never took any action. There were several preludes to the all-out genocide yet to come. In July of 1908, a military coup took place by some army officers calling themselves the Young Turks. This brought hope to the Armenian Christians as the Young Turks removed Sultan Hamid II from power. The country, for a time, returned to a constitutional monarchy. To the Armenians' great satisfaction, the Young Turks appeared to be anti-Hamidian and hoped that the continued massacres would end and any violence would be a thing of the past. However, a counter-coup occurred the following year in 1909, where some reactionary Ottoman military elements, joined by some Islamic theology students, aimed to return control of the country back to the Sultan. Although the counter-coup's main target was the Young Turk movement, they continued the persecution of the Armenians as they, the counter-coup, believed the Armenians supported the pro-constitutional movement. Known as the Adana Massacre of 1909, Historical estimates reached between 15,000 and 30,000 Armenians were massacred. The wholesale genocide of Armenian Christians began as a result of the First Balkan War that took place in 1912. As a result of the loss of the war, Muslims saw themselves expelled from various parts of the Balkans and settled in Anatolia. The Armenians' population formed the minority in this region. More than 850,000 Muslims were settled in areas where most Armenians resided. Most of these muhacirs, as they became known, resented that Armenians held a higher social standing than the refugees. When World War I began, the Ottoman Empire opened their part in the war by entering the hostilities on the side of the Central Powers, Germany and Austria-Hungary, and lost their first major battle against the Russians-Armenians in December 1914. In November of 1914, Sheikh-ul-Islam declared a jihad against the Christians. Enver Pasha, the general leading the Turkish forces that lost the battle, blamed the Armenians for his embarrassing loss and used the jihad to wipe out the Armenians. Thereafter, Armenian Christians found themselves into forced labor battalions in 1915. War Minister Enver Pasha issued a directive which, quote, increased security and precaution, end quote, to all military units for the removal of all ethnic Armenians from their posts and for their demobilization. Pasha believed that the Armenians would share secrets with the Russians and made sure that the Armenians would remain unarmed, an action which would prove essential for the upcoming massacres. In April of 1915, the governor of a city, Cevdet Bey, demanded that the city of Van furnish him with 4,000 soldiers under the pretext of conscription. Bey was the brother-in-law of Enver Pasha, so noted historians have revealed that a conspiracy was afoot to massacre the Armenians wholesale. The Armenians offered Bey 500 male soldiers and gave him money to exempt the rest. Bey became angry and accused the Armenians of orchestrating a rebellion. Bey stated he would crush any rebellion at any cost. On April 20th, 1915, the siege of Van began when an Armenian woman was harassed and the 2 Armenian men who came to her rescue were killed by the Ottoman soldiers. As the episode escalated, Armenian defenders protected 30,000 residents and 15,000 refugees who were cornered into a quarter of the city suburb known as Agistan. The Armenians held out as long as the Russians under General Yudenich came to their rescue. Word of the siege reached the United States ambassador to the Ottoman Empire, Henry Morgenthau Jr., and he expressed these concerns to Enver Pasha, who stated that the deportations were all of the conduct of the war. Pasha justified the persecution of the Armenians through the deportations. Early in the war, the Ottomans stated that the deportations and massacres were all part of maintaining the security of the empire, and that the Armenians were a threat to that security. One military officer discussed the planning of the incident that happened next.
In order to justify this enormous crime, the requisite propaganda material was thoroughly prepared in Istanbul. It included such statements as, "The Armenians are in league with the enemy. They will launch an uprising in Istanbul, killing off the Etidist leaders, and will succeed in opening up the straits for the Dardanelles."
Finally, between April 23rd and 24th, 1915, known as Red Sunday, rounded up and imprisoned over 250 Armenian intellectual and community leaders of the Ottoman capital and were later moved to Ankara. On this date also occurred the Gallipoli landings by the Allies and the unsuccessful naval bombings and breakthrough of the Dardanelles in the previous 2 months. A law passed in May 1915, the Taseer Law, provided for the deportation and assassination of the Armenian leaders. April 24th is commemorated by Armenians all over the world every year. In May 1915, Mehmet Talat Pasha requested that the cabinet legalize a measure for the deportation of Armenians due to various riots and massacres that occurred around the empire. Of course, this was a ruse designed to justify the wholesale murder of Armenian Christians. At the end of May of that year, the Turkish Central Committee passed the temporary law of deportation where the Ottoman government could deport anyone they sensed as a threat to national security. The massacre of Armenians already reached the ears of the Western powers and enraged whole populations around the world. The press in the United States characterized the massacres and the treatment of the Armenians within the Ottoman Empire as systematic, authorized, and organized by the government. Theodore Roosevelt, former president of the United States, stated that the massacres were the greatest crime of the war. After the laws were passed and the Ottoman government continued to stress that the deportation and massacres were all a matter of national security, the death marches began. The Turkish military marched tens of thousands of Armenian Christians out of the Syrian town of Deir ez-Zor and the surrounding desert. The Ottoman government deliberately withheld supplies and facilities to the marches, and thus hundreds of thousands of Armenians died in the desert. Talat Pasha knew very well by abandoning the Armenians to the elements, certain death would occur. The death rate rose steadily as more and more Armenians died in the Syrian desert of starvation and dehydration. Major General Otto von Lossow, the acting German military attaché and head of the German plenipotentiary in the Ottoman Empire, spoke to the Ottoman intentions in a conference held in Batum in 1918.
The Turks embarked upon the total extermination of the Armenians in Transcaucasia, the aim of Turkish policy. As I have reiterated, the taking possession of Armenian districts and the extermination of the Armenians. Talat's government wants to destroy all Armenians, not just in Turkey, but also outside of Turkey.
General von Lossow also stated that cases of rape are rampant because the soldiers were given orders from their superiors to do what they wanted with the females and the children. Some women were violated by no less than 10 to 15 men. Just in case the Armenians survived their death marches, the Ottomans built concentration camps. Denied food, water, and medical care, these camps saw the demise of even more Armenians. Muslims desired Armenian women most of all for marriage. These marriages, hasty and unloving, were registered through the Ottoman government, but former Armenian husbands of these women was not recorded. A German-born American named Bernau traveled to the areas where the Armenians were being held and wrote a report later corroborated through the German consul in Aleppo, Turkey, Dr. Walter Rossler. Bernau reported the existence of mass graves containing no less than 60,000 Armenians in Meskin, where he divulged a lot of victims died as a result of starvation and disease. Dysentery spread throughout concentration camps, and days would pass between the distribution of small amounts of bread. Starvation was so rampant that camp internees looked through horse manure for edible food to eat. Special groups formed before the war came into action around 1914 and were known as the, quote, butchers of the human species, end quote. These special groups functioned mostly as assassination squads tasked with finding and executing Armenian Christians. The Special Action Squads, reminiscent of the Einsatzgruppen of the SS during World War II, mainly burned their victims alive. Another method instituted was drowning. Boatloads of Armenian children were loaded into boats and thrown out of the boats in the middle of a lake. In the Trabzon province, officials estimated that 50,000 Armenian Christians drowned as a result of this method. Around the empire, eyewitness accounts of drownings permeated the filing cabinets of foreign diplomats in Turkey. The Ottomans also used medical means by which to exterminate the Armenian Christians. The victims were injected with lethal doses of morphine, toxic gas, and typhoid inoculations. Dr. Tevfik Rushdu, Inspector General of Health Services, attempted to get rid of Armenian corpses by dumping tons of quicklime over the bodies and burying them. The Ottomans also confiscated the properties and belongings of dead Armenians. The values of these properties varied, and the Turks used them to finance their mission of death. As of this writing, no restitution has been given to the families of the victims of the Armenian genocide. After World War I and the end of the Ottoman Empire, war trials commenced to hold those responsible for the genocide accountable. The three pashas responsible for the formulation and execution of the genocide, Mehmed Talat Pasha, Ismail Enver Pasha, and Ahmed Izzet Pasha, all fled the Ottoman Empire. As delegates from around the world gathered in Paris for the peace talks regarding World War I, U.S. Secretary of State Robert Lansing summoned Sultan Mehmed VI and Grand Vizier Damat Ferid Pasha. On July 11, 1919, Damat Pasha officially confessed to the Armenian genocide and was a key initiator to the war crimes trials after the war. The three pashas were found guilty of war crimes against the Armenians and sentenced to death in absentia. Two of the three pashas were assassinated by the Armenian vigilantes under the code name Operation Nemesis. After the war crimes trials, Henry Morgenthau founded an organization known as the American Committee for American and Syrian Relief to help those survivors of the genocide. Overall estimates as to the deaths of Armenian Christians during the genocide range from between 850,000 to 1.5 million Armenians killed. Even though the massacres, burnings, and rapes were well documented, the Turkish people still refused to discuss the genocide. In Morgenthau's memoirs, he wrote, "When Turkish authorities gave the orders for these deportations, they were merely giving the death warrant to a whole race. They understood this well, and in their conversations with me, they made no particular attempt to conceal the fact." For almost a century, the Turks tried to refute any claims that Armenian Christians suffered as a result of the genocide. Armenian diaspora committees have sought to obtain recognition of the Armenian genocide from countries around the world. Only one state in the United States had never bothered to recognize the genocide, Mississippi, but Louisiana later recognized the genocide in 2004. During his administration, Barack Obama would never use the word genocide to describe the massacre of Armenian Christians from 1915 to 1923. Ever wonder why? With the attempted destruction of Armenian Christians in Turkey, the Ottoman Empire sought to also eliminate a culture. There have also been some questions regarding reparations, as the current Turkish government is the successor of the Ottoman Empire and therefore responsible for reparations to the surviving families and/or their descendants. During the genocide, even the Germans, in a foreshadowing of the Holocaust to come some 25 years later, hailed the Turkish government for the persecution and execution of Armenians. Count Ernst von Rentlow, he stated that the treatment of the Armenians proved a measure of justified and necessary character. The massacres continued into 1916, and therefore the request for aid for the embattled people trying to just sustain life long enough to escape the clutches of the Ottoman Empire. In 2004, California passed the Armenian Genocide Insurance Act based upon 2,400 life insurance policies that the Ottoman Empire took out on the victims they massacred. The settlement with the Turkish government yielded a total of $20 million, $11 million for the descendants and the other $9 million for in sundry expenses such as court filings and other legal expenses. To preserve the memory of the Armenian genocide, books, movies, and songs have been written over the years. One of the most recent movies, The Promise, used the genocide as a backdrop for the story that was told. 135 memorials are situated around the world by those Armenian Christians who appreciate the sacrifice of their ancestors. The next time someone asks whether Holocaust or genocide can happen again, tell them to look toward Africa and the mass executions of Christians that are occurring at the hands of Muslims on that continent. Or you can look to the death of a 5-year-old boy here on American soil thrown from a third-floor stairwell in a shopping mall. His only crime was being white and assumed Christian. One newspaper in the United States called the Turkish Ottomans for their treatment of the Armenians to be tyrannical, of a barbarous age, and is upheld only by the sophistry and the perversion of the truth. Until next time.